Nowadays, social networking is one of the most influential media that we have. When we woke up, the first thing that we do is checking our social net accounts. We got emails for business-minded people, Facebook for our parents, and Twitter for the teenagers. But where do this medium empowering from? And that's what our group is going to discuss. First, let us talk about the history of social networking. The second thing is the definition of social networking, its users, and its functions.
Initially, internet was only for military-centric command and control scheme purposes, but eventually, it turned out to be an expanded medium to have an access even the simplest citizen to the other side of the globe. Way back in 70s and 80s, computers at that time were far rarer than commodity. In addition, people those times were not used in being alone in front of a computer, given that the machine's language was puzzled and had only limited potentials. But when BBS was created that time, it all started. BBS are online meeting places where users were allowed to communicate inter-central systems where they can download files and games and access post messages to and from other users. Before the internet gained its popularity on late 80s and early 90s, a service allowed users to share files and access news and events called CompuServe. And more importantly, it allowed true interaction by having the chance to join forums of CompuServe and talk with the other virtual members for any given topic for the day. But America's Online was said to be the true precursor of the internet that we have today. Members created an online communities where they can share them members' profiles. In that point, there's no stopping for the internet. Yahoo had just set up shop, Amazon had just begun selling books, and the race to get the PC in every household was on. And by 1995, the site that may have been the first to fulfill the modern definition of social networking was born. The first idea was to connect with the user's acquaintance or friend. 6degrees.com in 1997 bloomed where you can encourage your friends to go online, then join the site where you can also share your profile. Friendster was launched in 2002 by the help of its CEO Jonathan Abrams. Friendster was dubbed a circle of friends and promoted the idea that a rich online community can exist only between people who truly have common bonds, and it ensured there were plenty of ways to discover those bonds. But nowadays, Friendster only exists as an online gaming site after of its years of success in the Philippines as well as in Indonesia. LinkedIn 2003, created for more serious businessmen who want to connect with other professionals rather than a meeting place for friends by Don Juan. Now, LinkedIn has more than 297 million members. MySpace also launched in 2003, who was once a perennial favorite. They showed Friendsters what they missed: music videos, and feature-filled environment. Today, this site still exists but more for music and band-targeted audiences. Facebook, today's biggest and most successful social networking site. This site opened in public in 2006. There's a universal agreement for the Facebook's success. Facebook promotes both honesty and openness. It seems people really enjoy being themselves and throwing that openness out there for all to see. Stated that the definition of social networking is the use of internet-based social media programs to make connections with friends, family, classmates, customers, and clients. Social networking can be done for social purposes, business purposes, or both. The programs show the associations between individuals and facilitate the acquisition of new contacts. Examples of social networking have included Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and YouTube. Functions of the social networking: content uploads, public galleries, running lines, private and public, internal and external communications, profiles, content moderation, online radio channels, advertisement, SMS messaging, picture messaging, email, address book, chat, photo, video, and audience albums, friends, contacts, groups, quiz, front and back ends, feedback, development, adaptability, maintenance, voting, sharing, experiencing, wall, blog, and forum. In May 2013, 74% of women were users of social networking sites compared with 62% of men. Between February 2005 and August 2006, the use of social networking sites among young adult internet users ages 18 to 29 jumped from 9% to 49%. Social networking site used by age group over time. Based on the social media update of Maeve Dugan and Aaron Smith, 42% of online adults use multiple social networking sites, but Facebook remains the platform of choice. Twitter and Instagram have particular appeal to the younger adults, urban dwellers, and non-whites, and there is substantial overlap between Twitter and Instagram users' bases. Facebook and Instagram exhibit especially high levels of user engagement. A majority of users on these sites check onto them into a daily basis.
The third one is the review about the critical analysis of social networking impact on personal and social life by the school management, KIIT University.
The popularity of social networking sites can't be denied nowadays, but in exchange, the users demand an introspection of personal and social behavior of humans. As in a site help to create a nice profile, but sometimes it can also lead to anxiety and addiction. It starts affecting personal relationship with family members and friends. The private and public life of an individual made to be a digital document. In a statement by Mooney on 2009, social networking sites, email, instant messaging, video and photo sharing sites, and comment posting are tools that help people to communicate and socialize with each other. Here's the top 10 list of the most popular social networking sites based on their Alexa Global Traffic Rank and Traffic Rank from Compete and Quantcast. 10th, Meetup. 9th, My Yearbook. 8th, High Five. 7th, Classmates. 6th, Tag. 5th, Ning. 4th, LinkedIn. 3rd, MySpace. 2nd, Twitter. At number 1, who has an estimated unique monthly visitors of 550 million, is Facebook. Biological impact of social networking. Social networking users face severe health risk because they reduce face-to-face contact and become addicted in a virtual world of relationships. Eric Sigman, Fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, says social networking sites have played a significant role in making people become more isolated. Lack of face-to-face contacts could alter the way genes work, upset immune responses, hormonal levels, function of arteries, and influence mental performance. It affects work productivity. People spend hours chatting with their friends and browsing profiles on social networking sites. It becomes a compulsive habit to visit own profiles several times in a day for checking friends' updates, changing status, and commenting on other photos and videos. Finally, it diverts employees' attention from the office work. Facebook addiction disorder. It is like people being immersed in virtual life and forgetting about the physical world around them. Dr. Jhounel says there are 5 clues that show if you are addicted to Facebook. First, you start losing sleep over Facebook and that hampers your daily activity. Second, you spend more than an hour on Facebook. Third, you become obsessed with your old loves and start visiting their profile. And gradually, it starts to affect your current relationship status. Fourth, you tend to ignore work and use Facebook in office hours. And fifth, when you think of going a day without Facebook, it causes stress and anxiety to you. How it is helping cybercriminals. The beginning of social networking sites started to make contact with people and build a network of healthy relationship in the society. But now, it seems offering cyber criminals a great advantage to target victims. A report by Daily Mail shows crimes associated with the networking sites have increased in some area, including cases of murder, rape, pedophilia, bullying, assault, and burglary. The secure feeling of being anonymous in SNS encourages a person to commit cybercrimes that a normal person would have never committed in real world. The major problem is that there is no way to verify the actual identity on cyberspace, and the criminals takes advantage of this. The power to destroy relationships. Social networking site that once was thought to be helping people across the world to unite and making new relationship can also damage the relationship and make life miserable. A research conducted on 308 Facebook users found that 74.6 are likely to add previous romantic or sexual partner as friends on Facebook. Today's social networking site making it much easier. Your spouse not feeling good to have sex with you but seeking sexual solicitation from Facebook friend. How to remain safe in SNS? You must be aware of certain things when discussing your private life in public. These are some of the tips you can make you and your family safe on the networking sites. First, change the profile privacy now. Second, do not accept friendship requests from strangers. Third, do not post very personal information on the profile. Fourth, be cautious while posting your photo. Fifth, do not post your current location when on a tour. Sixth, make distance from your ex profile. Seventh, don't post negative things about your life. Eighth, do not substitute real friends with virtual friends. And ninth, avoid using social networking sites in work hours.
Lastly, let's talk about the ECAR Research 2008 on social networking sites.
Because of the continuous development of the product of the SNS companies, the application also starts to grow. Campus administrators are exploring ways to use SNS, and faculty are experimenting to use these sites as a support in learning. Based on the ECAR data, Net generation students are the most avid SNS users, but older students are joining the SNS user ranks as well. And despite speculations that SNS have become all-consuming for students, it appears that most students have reasonably and moderately integrated SNS into their already technology-rich lives. Who uses SNS? In 2007, eMarketer reported that 37% of all internet users aged 18 and older, or 72 million people, used SNS at least once a month, and that 70% of all US teens aged 12 to 17 years old did so. They further estimate that SNS usage will continue to increase in 2008, with nearly 44% of adult internet users and 77% of teen internet users were predicted to visit an SNS at least once a month. Which SNS are used? SNS are clearly popular to undergraduates, and undeniably, Facebook is the number one of choice. Of the 85.2% of respondents, or simply it is, 9 out of 10 of the respondents use Facebook. The ECAR data suggests that there are no significant gender differences in the use of the SNS listed in the survey, with one exception. Females are slightly more likely to use MySpace than males. Profiles, friends, and groups. The table suggests that students generally focus their SNS activities on a limited number of sites. In fact, almost all SNS users frequent just 1 or 2 sites. And of those who say they use exactly 2 SNS, 88.1% report that these sites are Facebook and MySpace. Age does not seem to be a major factor in how many SNS a respondent uses, although those who use 3 or more SNS are somewhat more likely to be older respondents. Perhaps, younger respondents have a little reason to extend use beyond Facebook and MySpace, whereas older students benefit by adding a more specialized SNS such as LinkedIn for professional reasons. How SNS are used? For ECAR survey respondents, a primary use of SNS is communicating and sharing with friends. Of the 13 uses ECAR asked about, virtually all respondents report using SNS to stay in touch with friends. 2/3 report using SNS to share photos, music, and other works. Females more than males. And about half report using SNS to invite friends to events and as a way to find out more about people. Hours in SNS. In 2007, ECAR conducted an interview among students on how many hours they spend on using SNS. Those who spend more time online using SNS shows greater use of SNS in an area. These are the reasons. They have more friends, they often change their profiles, they report more SNS uses, and they are more likely to reveal their email addresses and IM screen names. Disclosing and protecting personal information. Researchers focused on concerns about teens and undergraduates' safety on the internet. SNS privacy problems can stem from the interplay between three factors. First, what personal identifiable data SNS access reveal? Second, what SNS protection capabilities are provided? And third, what specific end-user info on the SNS third parties are seeking out and using. The ECAR survey addresses these key issues, asking students, SNS users, what personal information they reveal on SNS, what access limitations they place on SNS profiles, and what extent they are concerned about privacy and security. Personal information revealed. It is common for all age group to include their names and photos on SNS. Among users 18 to 24 years old, about 80% reveal their last names and how they can be reached. Among users more than 24 years old, only half or fewer do so. And 21.1% of respondents from 18 to 24 years old reveal their mobile number. Privacy and security concerns. Older respondents report more concerns, although only 20.7% of SNS users from 18 to 19 years old are very or extremely concerned about misuse of personal info, and more than twice of 44.9% of those 30 years old and older are very extremely concerned. Overall, SNS users do not appear overly concerned about privacy and security issues. Restricting access to SNS profiles. Students may be willing to post personal information on SNS in part because they are confident about and use SNS access, limiting capabilities to ensure their privacy and protection. But then, it is suggested that understanding risks and consequences of security and privacy exposure, along with understanding methods of protecting personal information, can help students decide what information to reveal and protect. Reasons for not participating in SNS. ECAR asked the 18.8 respondents who do not use SNS why they do not participate, and ended up that the most common answer is that they are not interested or don't care at all.
The growth of social networking sites shows the significance of social and personal behavior of the internet users. SNS has become an essential medium of communication and entertainment among young adults, though it has started to affect the daily activities. Everything in this world can be used for a bad purpose as well as for good. It is us who can make the difference and utilize social networking sites wisely for the benefit of the social bands across the geographical borders.